Welcome back. Today I'm going to be going through some of the stuff you need to look for when you're changing ball joints on a solid front axle like a Dana 44 Chevy 10 volt. This particular one is a Dana 60, and probably some of the smaller stuff too, like a Dana 30 or who knows. This is going to be geared more specifically to those that have a repackable wheel bearing. Generally speaking, when they went to the hub style bearing, they changed the way some of this stuff works. If you have a solid front axle with repackable wheel bearings, go ahead and watch this. There's some tips that I'm going to show you that you really need to know when you're working on one of these front ends. If you like what you see, don't forget to hit that subscribe button, like, share, all that good stuff. The first thing I'm going to show you here is the upper ball joint. When you're putting this back together, and I just have this kind of loosely set in here. It's not really tightened or ready to go back together. On these older front ends, and I'm going to kind of separate that again by repackable wheel bearings, they will not have movement in the upper ball joint. So I've got the old ball joint here, and this one's pretty wasted and in a weird shape. But if you have a newer front end, like say a second gen Ram or newer, the ball joint actually moves in and out, and this is a much taller part here, and the ball joint will move in and out to make up this difference. On the older front ends, we have stuff like this sleeve. So in the case of this Ford, you can also use this for alignment. When you're changing the ball joints, you have to make sure that this is free to move. So when I took the old ball joints out, I then loosened this thing up. I took it out. Before I put it back in, I'm going to put some anti-seize on here, make sure everything's good to go, and then it sits down into this area. Now the reason that you have to make sure you are doing that is, and I'm not sure if you can see it, but this is a tapered seat. This is also tapered. Those seat together and create a strong bond. Now, if you don't have these moving right and you try to tighten them down, it'll put a lot of stress on these ball joints. And really, I don't know that it's going to do too much more than cause the ball joints to wear out a lot faster. It may actually, if you can't get it tightened, it may wobble around in there and possibly even damage the axle. But this is kind of the Ford style. I'm going to call it Ford style. I don't really remember the rest of them being like this. The rest of them, instead of having a sliding collar like that, if you look at this, this is a special socket for the Dana 44 and smaller, the old school ones like this. Down inside of here, this knuckle was actually threaded. This special tool dropped down over the stud, and you would adjust this. So you have to make sure that the threaded part inside of there actually moves. Again, this is all before you start putting it back together. You make sure that the threaded sleeve moves. And if you look down in, there'll be 4 different prongs. So you've got to get that moving. And then when you put it back together, you set the bottom one first. Like you back that one off, tighten the bottom up, then you tighten down the taper in the upper, and then you tighten the top down. There's a process to it. I'm not going to go through all. Like I said, I'm not going through the whole process here, just stuff that you need to know if you're doing one of these front ends. Okay, the next one is actually inside of this spindle area. So inside this spindle, we have a bearing, and a couple of seals actually go on the axle shaft. So what this bearing does is this bearing gives the inner axle shaft of this style of front end support and lets it roll smooth. So if we look at this one's in okay shape. I've seen much worse. I've also seen a little bit better. I'll polish this a little bit before we put it together. But this bearing rides right there. The seals, this one happens to have 2, and this is not the right way, but the seals ride behind that. And what those seals do is those seals seal up against the back end of this spindle and keep water and dirt out. Now, this is a spot that, especially if you off-road it, you've got one that's kind of older, this will allow water and nasty crap to get into your wheel bearings, which does 2 things. One, it destroys this area and destroys your axle shaft as a result. Usually it doesn't do too much damage inside the spindle, other than this is a hollow tube. So if water comes down there, it then gets out into this area where your wheel bearings ride, and it destroys your wheel bearings. So again, this is a pretty critical thing. Now, a lot, and this one is different, but a lot of your front ends will also have some type of retaining ring that holds the axle shaft tight, which then makes these seals work better. To be perfectly honest, I'm not exactly sure how this Ford really seals. It seems like kind of a poor design compared to some of the other ones that I've seen. But that was Ford's spec for Dana, I'm sure, and they built it that way. So there you go. Make sure that this bearing is in good shape. Make sure it gets packed with grease. Make sure your seals are good. Chances are, if you're taking this apart, you probably need to replace the seals. And if you're going to do that, a lot of time you get a bearing too. So that's the next one. Make sure that that whole area is well cleaned, greased, and ready to go. While we're talking about this spindle, I forgot this was greasy. This spindle sits onto the, in this case, 4 bolts, or 5, and goes back into this knuckle. One of the things you want to make sure that you do while you've got this apart, clean this area out, clean the area on the hub up, which I haven't done on this one yet, and put a little bit of anti-seize there, so when you put this back together and in 6 months you blow an axle joint, you can get this back apart and it's not an issue. They do actually make a tool that threads onto the end of this, and then you use a slide hammer to slide hammer and pull this out. And they actually work super nice. I'm not going to show you one of those right now, and you may not be able to find one. But if you clean and anti-seize this, you should be able to get it apart in the future. Most people under normal service don't have to take these apart real often. If you're out playing off-road, you'll probably have to take it apart, if nothing else, just to grease and check those seals at least once a year. And the last one I'm going to show you here is the retaining nut style for this type of axle, and this is pretty common for all of them. There are some slight differences, some slightly different designs, but this is what I think of for the most part on these ball joint style repackable front ends. So first of all, this inner nut, and I'm not sure if I get the right angle on it, you can see there's a pin that comes out of there. You have to make sure that this nut goes to the inside with the pin facing out towards the outside of the vehicle. The reason for that is that this washer is a lock washer that then goes in. That's why it's got all these holes. So we line this up in this washer, and it didn't quite fit there, but if I turn it around, it still doesn't fit. So I just picked a bad spot. So let's say, right about there. So let's say we've got our preload set, and this is where the wheel bearing is going to sit. We try to put that in, it didn't lock in right. You'll pull this back out, flip it over, and boom, right there. That pin is now in that hole. So what that does is it locks the inner nut from moving. So right there, that's as far as that nut can move because of the pin. Now the next step after that is to put the lock ring on, which then locks down and sandwiches that all together, which just the tightening that up also locks this together. But really we want that pin to go into a hole in the washer. Now these can be kind of a pain to get apart, but seeing them like this, now you see how they come apart. This one, I usually get like an angled pick in behind it and kind of work side to side, and it'll usually come out that way. There's probably a couple more things I could show you about these, but I think that's pretty well got the stuff that you're going to have a little bit trouble figuring out if you've never done one of these before. Thanks for watching. Again, hit that subscribe button. I'm trying to get this channel up over 1,000 views. And I'll see you later.